Oh, I'm daunted to talk about this one. Where do I even begin? There's so much one feels they have to comment on in regard to this film. What I mean by that, before even getting to the film itself, is its overwhelming context outright. Fortunately, I already discussed my opinions and views on Dune the Mythos in my earlier video on David Lynch's 1984 film, and so if you would like to hear these, as well as my more in-depth opinions on Lynch's picture, do give that a view. And now we need to address Denis Villeneuve, one of the most acclaimed and popularly beloved film directors working today. I happen to count myself among his fans, although I have a mild apprehension about awarding him a kind of godhood status, as I somewhat feel as though he has been granted, at least in the mainstream cinephile community. I hope that isn't just me being pretentiously terrified at agreeing with the dreaded masses on something, but there's also a part of me that feels as though Mr. Denis V has not been as cinematically adventurous as his earliest films promised. Considering the amount of money funneled into his recent projects, Denis has, to some degree, played it safe. To some degree, I will stress that. You see, my favourite film from his output is still probably 2000's Maelstrom, a film which begins with a seemingly dead trout opening its lips and beginning to question the existential validity of its audience. I mean, something so brazenly imaginative, trippy, and different on the budget that it had, it would have any devotee of the cinematic weird, or the creatively inventive, excited at the prospect of Denis' projects receiving substantial funding. I am a firm admirer of 2009's Polytechnique, although 2010's Incendies, brilliant as I consider it, does feel as though it was attracting the attention of the award ceremony establishment. Maybe this was just happenstance, though. It received a nomination for Best Foreign Language Film at the Academy Awards, if this is to be considered proof of a director having played it safe. I mean that as a joke, but it's almost interesting to think about. In 2013, Denis would follow this with a more mainstream dramatic picture in Prisoners, and an easily digestible Lynchian homage in Enemy. I definitely dug Prisoners, and Enemy I absolutely loved. As obviously a piece of a creative legacy it might be, I utterly love its aesthetic execution and psychologically stressful affect. Enemy holds little surprises for those who have seen enough experimental narrative films, especially those post-Eraserhead, although for those who particularly love this cultish bracket, myself included, Enemy is easy to adore as a surreal simulation of some esoteric experiential right. Sicario was mainstream fare. I didn't love it. I don't hate it, I just acknowledge its existence and move forward. Then I completely love 2016's Arrival, considering it an example of Denis really capitalizing on his financial backing by adapting the work of a lesser-known, relatively, Hugo and Nebula award-winning author, Ted Chiang, with a degree of typically unprecedented aesthetic believability, an authentic illustration of humanity's first contact of extraterrestrial life, filtered through the pathological prism of its protagonist's mental malaise, colouring its surroundings with the palette of Louise Banks's haunted psyche. And then there was Blade Runner 2049. I love and worship Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, yeah, don't we all? But Blade Runner 2049, whilst I truly loved it as a narrative and aesthetic experience, I feel slightly jarred that, well, think about what Blade Runner was as a production in 1982. What was Blade Runner 2049 in 2017? Authentic, believable, fluid, and yet it doesn't feel entirely unique as a manifestation of film technology compared to the original picture. Ridley Scott's Blade Runner attempted to realize one of the most ambitious futuristic depictions in the history of human art, whereas Denis V sought to utilize established, albeit rather recently, technology in applied and familiar ways in order to compose imagery featuring Blade Runner's art design. I don't bemoan this in and of itself, actually I sort of revere that in and of itself, but comparatively, you may understand what I mean. And then thematically, it acts more like an extended epilogue to its predecessor than a proper sequel, in my opinion. Blade Runner introduced a degree of philosophic sophistication to cinematic science fiction, which inspired entire education curriculums, whereas 2049 just wanders around within Blade Runner's established metaphysical musings, unless I have overlooked anything. Still, I find it relentlessly involving and existentially gripping at its wondrous heights. I'm altogether a definite fan of Blade Runner 2049. I now consider that perhaps I'm selfish in wanting more. Actually, I probably am, from this tremendous director's filmography, but I can't ignore that mental itch either, as nitpicky as it might come across. Denis feels more like a contemporary traditionalist to me than a forward thinker. He looks to the great works of the past and seeks to enhance them with current technology, without seemingly realizing that his predecessors were seeking to compose original visions, new imaginations, to raise consciousness to fresh heights, not to remaster and recelebrate the glories of the past while acknowledging the recent innovative glories of the present day. Does Denis look toward the future? I am rather unsure. And so I am told that one of his many passion projects was adapting Frank Herbert's Dune. And so what do you present to me here, Denis? To get this out of the way, to resolve any irritating tension, I did resolutely love Villeneuve's Dune Part 1. Now, did it match my dream Dune film? Not even invoking Hodorowski's vision, which doesn't count in this case, as he hadn't even read Dune and wasn't attempting to translate it in the same way as we're currently discussing and thinking. One's dream film adaptation of Herbert's Odyssey is not actually realizable. No one has realistic expectations of a cinematic Dune adaptation. People's expectations for a Dune adaptation are, subconsciously, higher than the general expectations for a new Star Wars release. At one time. Now, whilst the hype might not manifest in the same way as the mass sums whom were retrospectively accused of overhyping a VFX vehicle space opera meant for young children, those who are in, so to say, on Frank Herbert's Dune, the "oh Dune bro" crowd, and you all know exactly what I mean the kinds of people who use Reddit, as well as a few others, who like the idea that enjoying something as metal as Dune is also very intellectual, big-brained and sophisticated, because Asimov's foundation cycle is too long. Don't get me wrong, I haven't read Asimov either. I'm too busy gorging on films, as it were. But let's not pretend Dune is going to represent evidence of intellectual coolness or whatever the fuck the Redditors think it does for them. Anyway, people such as this hypothetical archetype, people who happily use the website Reddit to share their opinions on art and such, are going to have unreasonably high expectations of a Dune film adaptation. It would have to be beyond perfect. No bad dialogue, no wasted actions, no intonal spells of anhedonia, no feeling except overwhelming euphoria. That is the film which is screening in your ideal Dune adaptation dream. It is. It's never going to exist. Take what you have. And what we have has some minor issues, which I cannot ignore and will address. For otherwise, I can't help but feel as though to have major issues with this film is to dismiss the sheer existence, or hope, of cinema capturing a demonstration of the sublime. That sounds needlessly lofty. It does and is. But what I mean to say is that no one is going to gauge this film as an original film production that appears in front of them on their technology of choice. It is Dune. Alright, Dune, impress me! Okay, well of course a Dune adaptation is supposed to have awe-inspiring scope, dedicated faithfulness to the source material, be a vivid realization of Herbert's technological imagination, as well as a believable and realistic depiction of a fictional future, and contain generally superlative staging aesthetics, direction of motion, and wholly phenomenal imagery. But what else has it got for me? Now, some people are disappointed at Denis Villeneuve's aesthetic across his films. They find it cold, uncharismatic, and dry. This I do understand. I consider his photography to be fairly clinical. He may seek to be depicting lived existence as callous and naked, but I'm unsure. I felt it extremely appropriate for Arrival, and obviously for Enemy, although to some I can understand why this sheen over Arrakis is a personal artistic disappointment. We'll say that. Let me address my negative feelings from this film before I discuss my more positive takeaways. As I just intimated, Dune 2021 is painted with a certain clinical coldness. Now, to be fair, it is attempting to realise or recreate Dune as a convincing act of hard science fiction, and that may have been the most effective way to go if you wanted to convey that. Maybe. Now, what occurred to me was this. This might seem like a bizarre observation, but here I go. If David Lynch's film was all style over substance, then this film is substance over style. What we have here is all substance, no surface. Like the novel, all technology depicted is very logical. Again, no style over substance. To the point to the possible con of having no surface. If substance is defined as the film's content, then its surface style would be defined as its choice of presentation. If it chose to depict Dune as a narrative which would speak for itself as cold, hard science fiction, no epic sheen, no romantic veneer, no mythological significance, no expressionistic fervour, just show it as it is. I'm probably being charitable with the whole hard clinical sci-fi thing as it is. A part of me considers blaming cinematographer Greig Fraser. I liked his take on the Star Wars original trilogy aesthetic when he photographed Rogue One. I felt it suited the gritty, grungy tailoring of Lucas's initial Star Wars vision. But I cannot feel as though Dune, while succeeding at creating the illusion of cinematographic scope, it lacks a certain, let's say, Freddie Young or Gilbert Taylor or Andrew Lesnie charisma. Hell, I'd imagine even Roger Deakins, who shot Blade Runner 2049 for Denis, could have gifted this film's photography with more temperament. I bring up Andrew Lesnie there for a reason. He shot Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy. Think about what a cinematic milestone that adaptation represented. Not only did it utilize contemporary VFX technology to realize a previously unfilmable narrative, but it thoroughly raised the bar on audiences' expectations for epic cinema. It is difficult to imagine a cinematic environment without the looming eye of Jackson's trilogy. It is pretty early into its actual release, but is Dune Part 1 in 2021 what The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring was in 2001? Not even close. I mean, how could one possibly argue it is? Did it have to be? No, not necessarily. Was Tolkien's trilogy a more inherently haughty, ambitious production compared to Frank Herbert's anyway? After all, an attempt at Dune was released in '84, and there was also the TV miniseries, but TV basically stinks, prior to the live-action realization of The Rings. Maybe Dune doesn't necessarily lend itself to forward-thinking cinema. It didn't overwhelmingly display that in 1984 either. Still, imagine a film which truly suspended our imaginative prospects of what the film medium was capable of, rather than a film which simply realized the established synopsis of a fantastical novel, rendering it visually believable and with a convincing realism. The latter is still wholly impressive to me, but alas, I can't ignore my yearnings. Okay, if anything encapsulates my problem with this production's overall unambitious philosophy, it's the fucking music. Is Hans Zimmer really a great composer? What the fuck has he done other than create the kind of music that an audience expects to hear in a scene? For the love of God, what memorable tunes has he composed? John Williams is sometimes standard in some respects, but at least John Williams could write a memorable melody. Remember, Williams wrote a piece of music which has become beyond ubiquitous for a fictional character who had been unfathomably iconic for decades prior in Superman. That truly amazes me sometimes how accurate that score was in illustrating a landmark cultural mythos. So yeah, anything such as this in Zimmer's work for Dune? Nope, none at all. Go away, Zimmer, no one wants you. And speaking of Superman, your work on Man of Steel was forgettable trite, and Man of Steel was absolutely, utterly horrendous, and everyone involved in it ought to be ashamed. As much as people seem to hate on the DCU, nothing they have since released, except, I suppose, David Ayer's cult Melanoma Suicide Squad, has been worse than that offensive abomination from 2013. Oh, what would you have preferred to hear in Dune's 2021 soundtrack, bro? New music. The kind of music these new, futuristic, diverse cultures would listen to. Is that too much to ask? For Hans Zimmer, it appears so, yes. Ooh, what would people find effective music in this scene right now? So cliche, tired, stagnant thinking. Boring. Even when the score contains chanting within its arrangements, it's this contemporary Hollywood cinematic chanting. These calls should be unrecognizable. This is set well over 1,000 years from now. This is not good enough. This is not impressive. So yes, the music I have extremely mixed feelings about. Some of these sound effects I like more than the actual compositions, which, as I said, are a bit boring and disappointing. Generally unimaginative in a truly musical way. At its very best, it is still trying to be kind of familiar, but a bit alien and eerie, and either go in or go home, honestly. Bugger off with that playing it safe crap. You're adapting fucking Dune. No one is going to see it anyway. Take risks. Some nice sound design, obviously. The voice, sounds great. The Bene Gesserit voice, that sounds great, I must say. Anyway, moving on from the film's audio, I was occasionally annoyed at some moments in the picture which I felt didn't need to be as cinematic as they came across, or at least that one example in my mind, that being the extraction of the spice harvester. Paul's hallucinatory vision, and Gurney has to pull him out there. That was a bit unnecessary. This is one instance wherein I can confidently say that Lynch's take on a particular scene was better. In Lynch's case, he just followed the novel's chapter and made a cameo appearance in that very scene. And those are my major negative points on Dune Part 1. Now I shall elaborate on some more satiating positives. This fictional environment feels natural and real. Everything in front of our eyes is clearly a part of the same universe. Compare this to Lynch's depiction of Arrakis, or Caladan especially, which is quite obviously a series of sets. You're not going to tell me that the uniforms, architecture and technology of Lynch's Dune look like authentic creations of a universe and not film props. Think about the still suits in 84 versus 21. I mean, come on. Those plastic-looking rubbery leather things in 84 versus the still suits in 21. No contest. There is an overwhelming sense of love that permeates this production. The sheer believability, practicality and sensibility of the art design, as opposed to Lynch's film, and for better or for worse, nothing is goofy for goofy's sake. Instead, everything feels regal and futuristic. There is no aesthetic practicality within the art design within Lynch's film. It is just weird for its own sake. In fact, if I would like an aesthetic blueprint for a live-action realization of Legend of the Galactic Heroes, not that we'd want or need one, Dune 2021 is that blueprint. There was also a great believability to all of the performances. Everyone treats their character seriously, as though the director demanded that they do, imploring they take the source material seriously in a way almost certainly no one did on Lynch's set, at least comparatively. Apparently some viewers and subsequent reviewers were not fond of how taciturn and unfeeling a lot of the film's human interactions are, finding the performer's delivery rather stony, I guess. But I like the performances. This feels like a world wherein mentats exist, and the human race has dismantled computers so that their own minds might perform the desired functions of such. Think of the Dune universe's humans as having evolved to be like Vulcans. In fact, this film's clean, logical, functional futurism reminds me of Star Trek's general aesthetic during the Next Gen / Deep Space Nine era. Its clean sci-fi reminds me of not only Star Trek and Legend of the Galactic Heroes, but of Mobile Suit Gundam, speaking of anime, and the chrome cleanliness of James Cameron's 2009 blockbuster Carnival Avatar. And one very important point of praise I must share regarding this film's VFX. I stand and applaud the fulfillment of a digitally comprised fluidity of movement. This film features the perfect use and justification for CGI. There is no blockiness, no noticeable quantity of live-action clumsiness. Very few live-action CGI fusions have attained perfect physicality or achieved the freedom of pure animation. Some would argue Star Wars Episode 3 Revenge of the Sith was the only time this was ever realized, and James Cameron's Avatar came close but no cigar. I would love to ask these people their opinions on Dune's 2021's VFX in this particular regard. Man, I love practical effects, and especially those in Lynch's film, but by God, these worms look glorious. Meanwhile, I will also praise the film as finding a smart way to adapt Herbert's monster into a digestible film narrative screenplay. It is a well-paced screenplay, a terrifically effective condensation of Dune within a traditional screenplay format. As opposed to the alien laziness of Lynch's picture, mythos even he couldn't understand, Denis wants to be sure that everyone in his audience can appreciate and believe in the existence of Herbert's lavish fictional universe. One mixed review of this film which I felt a great affinity for was written for Burning Shore by one of my heroes, Eric Davis. Some of you may be aware I am gradually recording an audiobook of Davis's 2004 publication on Led Zeppelin's fourth album, which is a completely sensational read thus far. Anyway, I've been spending a lot time along the southern Mendocino coast of late, as much as possible really, but a few weeks ago I broke the spell and headed south to the city to catch the premiere of Denis Villeneuve's Dune. I've been invited to see it at a small private screening organised by some friends over at the Long Now Foundation, a gathering that took away the heebie-jeebies induced by the spectre of a packed house of utter strangers. I had just reread the book in anticipation of the flick, my second reread since teenhood, and I was preparing to be amazed and inspired and to channel that energy into an elaborate Burning Shore review that would dive into Dune's treatment of religion, the story's ecological underpinnings, and the Bay Area demimonde that Herbert, who palled around with Alan Watts, absorbed and transmuted when he wrote the first novels in the series. Maybe someday. I did not hate the film by any means, but I found it kind of dull. More specifically, I found myself appreciating it without much emotional or imaginative spark. Another disappointment, in other words. Frankly, I wish I'd stayed in Mendocino, where the massive swells that accompanied the recent atmospheric river sucked away all the sand from a nearby cove, like a famished and watery Shai Halud. Don't get me wrong, I was impressed and pleased at Villeneuve's fidelity to the novel, at least in the portions it included, but I missed the baroque complexities and vexed interiorities of the book, not to mention the funky wackadoodle of Lynch's version, which I watched in a fan cut years ago to great if sometimes strained amusement. The best Dune film, of course, is Jodorowsky's, playing at a parallel universe near you. As expected, Villeneuve's film looked terrific, his muted palette and sober minimalism well suited to Arrakis and its war machines. The Baron was gross, the Thopters and shields convincing, and the worms and their spice intoxicating enough. I was particularly impressed by the arrivalist attention Villeneuve brought to the multiple modes of communication, hand signs, prophecy, the voice, presented in the novel. But the sand, as it does, got into everything. I don't know about you, but the Lady Jessica in my head is a far less fragile character. Any Bene Gesserit worth her salt, let alone one capable of birthing the Kwisatz Haderach, would have evinced more control over the Mind Killer, or at least more deftly masked her struggles. The teen heartthrob omens that struck Paul also grew mighty tedious, and it didn't help that Zendaya, playing Chani, got framed as a pop exotica refresh of that Afghani girl from National Geographic. And though Herbert's novel is one of the most sophisticated science fictions to engage the anthropology of the sacred, exploring both prophetic Abrahamic faiths and more mystical spiritualities, the film basically dropped these balls, dodging the abyssal depths of Paul's space-time meltdowns and, for the most part, missing the opportunity to have fun with the Fremen's Islamic desert militancy. But none of these explain the emotional vacancy of the film, which, for all its action, was stately and monotonous. Some critics have complained that Villeneuve was too faithful to Herbert, which gave the film a lifeless, overly reverent quality utterly lacking, say, in The Delirious Lynch. I can hear that, but there is another, more interesting way to read this flatness, this sense that all the characters are simply going through the motions, and it has to do with how we read Paul's destiny, and the attitude towards that destiny that animates the original novel. Once Paul reads the writing on the proverbial wall and understands the messianic fate before him, he performs what PKD always saw as the essence of ethics. He balks, navigating the parallel currents of space-time that Villeneuve did not even attempt to illustrate. Paul tries to dodge the coming jihad in his own autocratic role in it. He doesn't want to rule but to simply abide. But Paul's efforts fail, and the path towards God, Emperor, and universal violence becomes set in narrative concrete. This sense of defeat, of human will foundering before the intransient karma of myth, characterizes the grim irony that characterizes Herbert's attitude towards his central protagonist, as well as his critical understanding of the religious patterns in human culture. Some reactionaries celebrate Dune as an Übermensch novel of old-school mastery and command, but these people are idiots who cannot read. Here's the hero's journey is really an implacable death march, a penal colony inscription machine, a self-fulfilling, and in the case of a Bene Gesserit, self-seeding, doom. Liet Kyne's father, an off-worlder who first bonded with the Fremen, tells him at one point that no more terrible disaster could befall your people than for them to fall into the hands of a hero. In one of the appendixes in the first edition, Herbert is even more clear. The planet Arrakis, like the planet Hollywood, is afflicted with a hero. From this perspective, the wan and mirthless narrative of Villeneuve's Dune is an effective index of Paul's submission to the already scripted demand of his own ascendance, a submission that the film also performs in sticking, relatively, close to a novel that so many have already read and reread. At a time of reactionary resurgence and increasingly feudal brutalisms, not to mention the pervasive sense that the story of civilization has us by the collective throat, such fatalism cannot help but strike us as sobering. Brilliant. If someone who enjoys Star Wars, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or Game of Thrones ever could enjoy an adaptation of Dune, here it is, but also entirely beholden and essentially pandering to at the same time, I must say this feat is impressive, toward fans of its beyond legendary novel. But what for those of us who are fans of cinema, period? Well, sadly, that is somewhat debatable, really. Again, I think an average audience member who dislikes this film simply has no faith, only cynicism in cinema as an art form. I think a fan of the novel who dislikes this film is a ludicrous, spoilt moron. I think a dedicated cinephile who dislikes this film might be onto something fundamental about this film's lack of forward thinking. It is almost as though this film and its filmmaker were aware of the bad news Mark Fisher told us, which we already knew anyway. The dimension of the future has disappeared. Or maybe Herbert's Dune was never meant to translate itself as innovative cinematic experimentation. It isn't as though it was a groundbreaking, creatively inventive novel either, just a very, very great one. That's it. I've got it there. It isn't as though Dune 2021 is a groundbreaking, creatively inventive film, just a very, very great one. Or maybe a work cannot be great without innovating, in the opinion of some, but then what's Frank Herbert's excuse, I ask? All I know is I cannot wait for Dune Part 2, and I will see it at the first possible opportunity. Well, that was tiring. Thank you all. Have a brilliant night.